Okay, cool. All right, well, good morning and welcome everyone to an environmental scan of the policy and funding landscape. Where are the opportunities? My name is Krista Brown and I'm the APS Leaders Institute Program Coordinator for the APS Workforce Innovations, also known as APSWI, and I'll be hosting this virtual training today. With my colleague Rabaz Taha and also my colleague Lori Delagrammaticus. And of course our presenters Bob Blancato and Bill Benson, who I'll introduce in just a minute. So before we begin, I'd like to go through just a few basics. The workshop is presented by the APS Leaders Institute, which is an ACL grant-funded program administered by CDSS in collaboration with APSWI at the Academy for Professional Excellence in NAPSA. I want to give a shout out to Lori and to Kim Rutledge, who I know will be joining us for all their help today. And Lori will be jumping in from time to time and helping with our transfer to practice. The overall goal of the APS Leaders Institute is to enhance the capacity for adult service administrators and APS program managers to drive program improvements by examining and building upon federal and state APS guidelines, current research, and best practices. We do that through these workshops, the statewide regional capacity building portion of the program, and also the evaluation of this program. Thus, the pre-post and end-of-day surveys we have you fill out. Just a reminder, we are recording this session and we'll make the recording available to APS managers and administrators who have registered for the November 18 and December 2nd booster on fiscal understanding of funding streams, which will be drilling down more for the specifics of California and the counties. And I'll discuss that a little bit more at the end of the training. So just let's see here. Let me move that slide. Okay, just a little bit about APSWI. The APS Leaders Institute is a program of APSWI, and APSWI is a training program of the Academy for Professional Excellence. And APSWI specifically provides innovative workforce development to APS professionals and their partners. And you'll see some of the other programs that the Academy for Professional Excellence has on the right side of the screen. I know everybody's getting really used to these online platforms, but just in case, here are a few basics. For Zoom, we have the mic where you can mute and unmute yourself. We have the start video where you can share and unshare your video. So if you're having some, oops, sounds like we got a little bit of, so go ahead and mute yourself if you're not talking so we can work with that background noise. We also have the participants window where you can change your name and raise your hand, and then the chat feature, which is really important to have open. We will be using that for questions and engaging with you. And then of course the reactions. So if you want to do some hand claps or some thumbs ups, those are kind of fun as well. So. Okay, so today's training will take place from 9 to 11. The flyer with agenda, the slides in writable PDF. Oh, I think we need someone to mute. Slides with writable PDF and 2 handouts. The Elder Justice Reauthorization Proposal materials and slide 33 with some SSBG information was sent out with the pretest. We'd like to make this an interactive experience, and we'll be taking questions during the course of the presentations and after each presenter speaks, so feel free to use the chat box for questions that come up during the presentations, and also feel free to unmute yourself for live questions. This is really your workshop. Please have your cameras on if you're able to, your mic's muted, Zoom window in full screen and chat box open. There was a pretest. Hopefully you had a chance to take that. And we will have time at the end for some feedback and your post-test end-of-day survey. And as I mentioned before, we are going to lock the training in a few minutes once we feel like most people are in. If you get kicked off, please email apstraining@sdsu.edu at the bottom of the screen, and we'll let you back in. And it'd be great if you can stay for the duration of the training. So without further ado, let me introduce our presenters. I want to say that these are brief bios. Both Bob and Bill have extended resumes and many accolades, but we only have 2 hours, so I had to edit them. Bob Blancato is the president of Motts, Blancato and Associates, the national coordinator of the bipartisan 3,000-member Elder Justice Coalition, and of the Defeat Malnutrition Today Coalition, and the executive director of the National Association of Nutrition and Aging Services Programs. Bob has more than 20 years of service in the congressional and executive branches, including the senior staff of the House Select Committee on Aging. Bill Benson is principal with Health Benefits ABCs, an organization offering health and aging policy, educational and strategic planning, consulting services, and is national policy advisor for NAPSA. Bill has worked on health and aging issues for 38 years or more, including in various leadership positions in the US Congress. Earlier in his career, he spent 10 years with the California Department on Aging, including serving as California State Long-Term Care Ombudsman. That's why he was able back in the day to name all 58 counties. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it on over to Bob, and I'll be back later. And thank you for being here today. And Bob, are you ready?
I am, Krista. Thank you very much.
Great.
Good morning to everyone. I'm coming to you live from from Washington, D.C., actually the NAPSA office, which is next door to us. And I want to say thanks to NAPSA for the invitation to participate today. And I want to just point out that, I work with a lot of groups in the work I do. And, there are a few, if any, that I know that represent their members any better in Washington than NAPSA. And that is Bill and Kendra and Lori at their best. I think people need to know that. Sometimes it's overlooked, particularly in these difficult times. And so I want to make sure you're aware of it from my perspective. And also that NAPSA, as an original member of the Elder Justice Coalition, has remained a key player in it for its entire history. And I also want to salute my colleague Meredith Whitmire, who is somewhere in this group, who is the policy director of the Elder Justice Coalition. And as you can see, our title is Elder Justice Legislative Status, Clear as Mud. I would just say it's not limited to elder justice. A lot of stuff here in Washington is not very clear at the moment. So Krista, can we go to the next slide? So we are entering the pivotal month of September in Washington. We are well into it. Why is it pivotal? Because the fiscal year, as many of you know, ends on September 30th. We are awaiting action on a new COVID emergency bill. Hang on a second. And this is the last full month of work in Washington before the election. So where does elder justice fit in? That is the question. Next slide. I guess the good news is that we have 4 of the 6 major pending bills do include a reauthorization of the 2010 Elder Justice Act, and 2 of those bills are authored by key committee chairs. Excuse me, my phone is ringing in the background. I need to get rid of it. I'm doing a webinar. I'll call you back. Okay. All right.
This is live workshops, folks.
This is live. This is not edited. No, that's right. And two of these bills are authored by key committee chairs: Senator Charles Grassley, the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, and his bill, which you have a copy of, I believe, and his companion bill is introduced by Congresswoman Wagner in the House side. And on the next slide, you'll see that the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, Congressman Richard Neal, is the sponsor of H.R. 8709, the Elder Justice Reauthorization Act, with a companion bill from Senator Wyden, who actually did introduce the bill since the time these slides were made, so that we'll put that number in the slides when we send them to you later. And of course, Senator Casey has a bill, the Nursing Home COVID-19 Protection and Prevention Act of 2020, which does not include an Elder Justice Act reauthorization, and he also has a companion bill in the House side by Congresswoman Eshoo from California. So on the next slide, you'll see what the difference differences are, they do differ, these bills, on how they renew the Elder Justice Act. The Grassley bill would renew funding for adult protective services, the ombudsman and the forensic centers, and would add FEMA to the Elder Justice Coordinating Council, which they should have done from the very beginning, frankly, particularly in light of the nursing home situation that we are dealing with now. Chairman Neal and Senator Wyden's bill would renew funding for APS, the ombudsman, add language on long-term care staffing that was in the original bill, funding for surveyors, as well as forensic centers. The one area of agreement in all the bills is they do call for a 4-year reauthorization of the Elder Justice Act, which we were happy to see be done. Now, if you go to the next slide, you'll see the all-important issue of proposed funding levels in the different bills. And they are significantly different, as you can see. And recognizing, of course, that these are what are called authorization levels. And those of you who have followed the history of the Elder Justice Act, there is a major difference between what is authorized and what is appropriated. But the old saying here in town is that if you don't set your authorization numbers high enough, you're going to have a harder time getting appropriations. So obviously, the House version, the Neal Wyden bill, is much more generous in terms of the funding it calls for all the different categories. My recollection, my guess is, frankly, that if we can come to an agreement on a bill, these numbers will probably come down. The numbers in the right-hand column will come down a little bit. But it's important to note that you know, there is support, significant support funding-wise for APS in both sets of bills. Let's go to the next slide. So, you know, where will elder justice reauthorization end up? And that's the big question that we wish we had the answer to. I wish I was more of a clairvoyant than I am. But the best option, and the one that we've all been working for here, is to have it be part of a fourth COVID emergency package. But that can only happen if we actually pass a fourth COVID emergency bill, which right now is as hard to figure out as anything going on right now. You've got a huge difference between what the Senate and House want to do for the next round of emergency funding. And I could spend my entire time talking about the major differences between the two, but let's just say that's a prerequisite. You have to pass that bill for anything to be attached to it. But it will never be attached if elder justice doesn't become bipartisan and an agreement can be reached on the provisions, as I put in the previous slides. It also, we've learned the hard way that we have to make a stronger case that elder justice issues are tied to COVID. You know they are, and I know they are, but it's convincing people in Congress, particularly those who are leading the effort in getting these bills done. They need to be convinced that there's a relationship to COVID. And then the other thing that says the only way this can happen is the concern about nursing home reform. It needs to stay strong, but it cannot overshadow the Elder Justice Act in an emergency COVID bill, meaning if people think that all they need to do is address nursing home reform in a bill like this and forget the rest of the Elder Justice Act, that's not a good situation. So we need to have a balance, as we try to do in our advocacy, between having both things covered in a final bill. So let's go to the next slide. And, you know, it's important to note that Senator Grassley, from the very beginning, has tried to seek and secure additional funding for APS and Ombudsman in the Senate's version of the COVID-4 bill. But he was turned down by the Senate leadership. And I think that's important to point out because that Senate leadership consists of Senator McConnell and Senator Cornyn of Texas, Senator McConnell of Kentucky, the majority leader, Senator Cornyn, and Senator Thune of South Dakota. They basically said, you know, they didn't see where this was necessary because they didn't see a relationship to COVID. And so, you know, that was sort of a setback along the way. But we continue to make the case and work with them. But since we don't know the larger issue of whether there's even going to be a bill and how long it's going to take to get a COVID-4 bill done, the outlook is not clear on that. Even though we think it's the best scenario for getting the Elder Justice Act done, it's a big unknown. And I'll tell you the two things basically that separate them right now. And there's about 10, but I'll give you the two big ones. One is state and local government funding. Now, all of you working in APS know that there's a crisis at the state and local and county level in funding, which is only going to get worse as time goes on. There needs to be an infusion of money in this next bill to prevent drastic cutbacks at the local level in funding. The other issue that's dividing them is how long and how big extended unemployment benefits should be for people. And until these differences are worked out, we're not going to see a COVID-4 emergency bill. So let's go to the next slide and talk about what next option there could be for the Elder Justice Act to get reauthorized. That is to have it be a freestanding bill that is passed by unanimous consent. Now, this can only happen if a Senate bill, and that has to get worked out between the two different bills on the Senate side. If we can get a Senate bill to prevail and then get the House to just agree on the Senate bill, that's the simplest way to get a freestanding bill done. Bill and I have had conversations on a regular basis with the Senator Grassley staff, as well as the Ways and Means staff about, that scenario. There'll be an opportunity to maybe take this bill up. As most people know, this is not a controversial area, and it really shouldn't be a partisan issue. But the question is going to be, will they see the opportunity to take this bill up separately and get it passed? Folks may remember that the Elder Justice Act of 2010 only passed because it was a Senate-driven process, and they ended up attaching it to the Affordable Care Act, and the House just went along with it and just said yes, and that's how we ended up in the law. This may end up being the scenario we have to think about for the Elder Justice Act of 2020. Let's go to the next slide. The third place where Elder Justice Act could end up is in an end-of-year Medicare extenders bill. Now, there are a number of provisions in Medicare and Medicaid, actually, that expire at the end of the year, technically at the end of the calendar year. But even there, the outlook on that is not particularly clear as to when a Medicare extenders bill would come up. There was a rumor this week that they may try to attach it to an end-of-year continuing resolution, which we all know has to happen for the federal government to stay open past September 30th. So when would it come up? What would be in it? How controversial would it be? And if we have to wait till a lame duck session of Congress, lame duck meaning after the election is over, and there's any sort of a flip of either the Senate or the White House, how does that impact the ability to get a Medicare extenders bill done? So unfortunately or fortunately, we have options. We have three options, but none are very clear, and some are clearly better than others. So as advocates, and this is a constant relationship that we have as advocates with Bill and I and others in our leadership, we monitor all these options equally, okay? And we try to move when we can, make things happen when we can, but we got to stay adaptable and very flexible to the environment that we're in, which is the way Washington operates. So let's go to the next slide. There are some other elder justice bills I just want to mention quickly. Fiscal year 2021 is coming. It starts October 1st. But as I just mentioned, it is you can almost take it to the bank that Congress will pass a continuing resolution, meaning whatever your funding level is now, based on fiscal year 20, that's going to be your funding level for another month or 2 months or 3 months. It isn't really clear. Nobody really knows how long they'll make the continuing resolution for. The two most prevailing pieces of, quote unquote wisdom are you do it until just after the election, or you do it into early next year. And the other big question tied to the continuing resolution is, will they somehow miraculously down at the very end of the process end up putting a COVID-4 bill into a continuing resolution? My guess is the answer is no. So we just have to follow the process, and the Elder Justice Coalition will put up the numbers that we'll be working for fiscal year 2021 at the appropriate time. And then we have S3703, a bill to the Promoting Alzheimer's Awareness to Prevent Elder Abuse Act, authored by Senator Collins of Maine. This is an amendment to an earlier bill, the Elder Abuse Prevention and Prosecution Act, which basically says we have to recognize the fact that victims of elder abuse who also have dementia and Alzheimer's need special training the people who work with them need special training, particularly law enforcement people. And this bill has passed the Senate, and there is a companion bill in the House, which just this week was taken up in the House Judiciary Committee. And as far as I know, it has come out of the committee, meaning the House will pass it probably in the next week or so. So let me go to the next two slides, which are the last two slides. It's probably an understatement. Maybe Bill will echo this when he gets on the screen. It's been a challenging year to do advocacy and elder justice. We've learned some things. The nursing home industry is still a powerful interest group. We've seen them stop things from going forward just simply because they have that level of influence with the key people in Congress. And the lesson we're learning is that we need to get to that level. We need to be as strong an interest group as they are. We're going to spend some time after this session of Congress is over talking about how to make the Elder Justice Act a stronger voice in that space. And it isn't just about doing advocacy, it's about having a little muscle and having a little bit of strong grassroots component and having some resources. Raising awareness is always important, but it's not as important as making something a political issue. In this environment, when you go back home as a member of Congress and you go to a town meeting or you do whatever you do now is a virtual meeting, whatever it may be, if your issue doesn't come up to them, then it's not a political issue. They need to know its importance in the local arena that they come from. And then all of a sudden it takes on a different dimension. And, we have not, at the grassroots level, done a good enough job about making that happen. You can get hurt by friendly fire as much as enemy fire. We have a lot of people working in the Elder Justice Coalition space. And sometimes, groups can get a little parochial and, sort of go on their own and not necessarily follow, the broad working of a coalition. And sometimes we end up finding out about those things, and we get called by congressional offices saying, what do we do here? And, we call that friendly fire because they should be working with us on this, and we hope we can limit that as much as possible. And then, I may get in trouble for saying this one, but maybe Bill will back me up. But, we got some, which I've not seen in all the years I've worked up here, we got personality issues at the staff level that are holding back policy decisions. And that's really not the way business should get done in this town. This should be about the issue. This should be about truthfully, what makes their bosses look the best, frankly. And, having them to fight over different things doesn't do us any good. And we are trying our best to work around that. But it has been a problem this year. And then finally, and the last slide, this game is by no means over yet, because we're going to work every single angle we can to keep things moving. And we're going to ask you to do your part with your House and Senate members when they're home. And, what I mean when they're home, they're going to be home pretty much for the month of October. And they're going to come back for a lame duck session. And most of the members that you work with are coming back. The message really simply is that, come back with an elder justice bill done. But you do that by educating and informing them about the importance of adult protective services in these times, but also downstream after this pandemic passes. Because I read every day reports that are emerging about what they expect to be the increased caseload that's going to come out once people have the ability to start reporting and the resources that APS can respond. So I'm going to ask people to make noise on this issue. Do your social media posts and your letters to the editor on behalf of reauthorizing the Elder Justice Act. And point out that the main beneficiary is the older adult who ends up not being abused because of the work you do. Make them appreciate and understand and value the work you do, but put it in that context, and I'm sure they will understand it. So with that, and Krista, thank you so much for your help on keeping the slides moving along, and I guess we go to whatever you tell us we do.
Yeah, no, thanks, Bob. That was great. So we're going to open it up to some questions before Bob has to jump off and jump on another Zoom call, I believe. So any questions, comments? Lori or Bill, is there any NAPSA framed response to what Bob has presented?
I'll just echo all of Bob's points, but particularly the lessons learned slide at the very end. I completely agree with Bob. We've never seen anything like this, not just in terms of a pandemic, but just in the way the process is working, the personality issues, the friendly fire issues that Bob talked about. I just need to echo that, because I'm not going to get into that in my presentation in particular, but those are really important points. And I like Bob's comment about, trying to figure out how we try to match some of the other powerhouse industries like the nursing home industry. And that's a tall order. And but that's what we've got to do, because if it's not if we don't make it a political issue, as Bob said, we're not going to get much further down the stream.
And this
Great.
is
Oh,
Lori.
go ahead, Lori.
I'd just like to thank Bob for all the work he's been doing with the Elder Justice Coalition, all the advocacy work he's been doing, and to remind people on this call that obviously within your role as government officials, there's maybe not be a way you can do advocacy, but you can always do education. And we would love to see you do more of that. And you do have representatives from CWDA in Washington that can be your voice there as well. So helping them to join with us to make this a political issue would be extremely helpful. So that's
Laura, that's a good point, Laura. I want to echo that point or elaborate a little bit on that. Based on another experience that we've had working in another advocacy arena, we have folks that do work in providing meals for older adults. And one of the most important things that's happened in the pandemic was our ability at the national level to reach out to people at the local level to get stories about impact. Okay, what will a pandemic mean for service delivery? Okay, and what can you anticipate? What do you envision? All right, and that gets translated into how funding levels can be set for emergency funding. So I'll give you the example that we use the most. The Older Americans Act nutrition programs that many of you know, Meals on Wheels, Congregate Meals, and so on, has gotten $750 million in just emergency fund this year, simply because folks who are under the same constraints that many APS folks are under were providing education and information to advocacy groups who can then give it to Congress. So remember that value of the stories, the issues you confront, the experience, the frontline work that you do, you need to send that to Bill and to Kendra and to Lori, so that when they are asked by folks in Congress, what's the story, you can share that with them. This is not a time when we're looking for deep empirical research. This is an emergency we're dealing with. And Congress is moving at unprecedented speed to address these issues. So let's remember that feature, that you all have that capacity, and we hope you'll use it.
So Jill actually has had her hand up. So Jill, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was interested to know what the role for state elder justice coalitions might be in the advocacy arena. California is lucky that we do have a statewide elder justice coalition, and they are a partner to CWDA. They can do a lot of the advocacy efforts that may be restricted for those of us working in local government. And I'm just wondering if also specifically if the National Association is really active in what they're doing.
Thank you, Jill. One of the more recent members of our coalition was that Alliance of State Elder Justice Coalitions that Georgia, Annisburg, and others, Lisa, Nirenberg, and folks have joined. I anticipate that they'll be more engaged as we go forward. I know the California group does a good job and does some good work, but they created an alliance of other states that have elder justice coalitions. And more than likely, and we did a webinar. I think Meredith and I did a webinar for them when they got started in joining us. But the answer is yes, they need to do more. They need to do more with their specific congressional delegations, because at this point, that's really where the action is going to be. We'll spend some time with them in this home stretch, if you will, making sure that they're as activated as they can be. But thanks for raising. That's a good point.
And it looks like Lee Pullen, you have your hand up as well.
Yes, thank you, Krista, and thank you, Mr. Blancato. I always enjoy listening to you. especially my favorite time of the year is the ASA panel of pundits. We do, as Lori's pointing out, education, advocacy, storytelling, but could you explain, like, where is the difference between raising awareness and making something a political issue? I don't quite get that.
Well, that's a fine line, Lee. What my point is, when you make something a political issue, you engage in some of the political tactics that go on that other groups will use. For example, and I'm not necessarily saying we're at that level yet, but for example, in groups like a nursing home industry have political action committees, okay, that exist to provide contributions to members of Congress. They will also point out where they have economic impact in a given state or district based on how many employees they have in the nursing homes, and they use the economic development argument well. You know, they will come to fundraisers where members, you know, Congress is having their event and raise the issue in that setting, which oftentimes is a smaller setting. And I tell people, you don't have to be a millionaire to engage in political action. I do it myself. You know, I don't have my own PAC. You know, I write checks and go to things based on who I think is important that I need to work with. But I know that when I go there, I have a small audience to work with. I have the opportunity to actually talk to the member of Congress about the issue. And it's even better at the local level, you know, when they have a breakfast at something. But the other thing to do is, if you go to, like they go to, again, world has changed because of the pandemic, but when they would do events in given areas, Rotary clubs or, you know, whatever it may be, you got to be the one that gets up and asks the question, you know, and your question can be in the context of education, information, without being political. You don't have to go and say, I'm going to oppose you, or I'm going to support your opponent if you don't agree with it. I'm going to say, you know, Senator, do you realize what in fact is going on right now in our area because of the pandemic? Do you realize how much caseload we have compared to what we have the ability to respond, whatever it may be? But, and then of course, you write a letter to the editor, you put something in the paper, you do a post somewhere. Those are all activities that have political implications, and people should utilize them more. So that's, I hope that helps a little bit.
Does that answer your question, Lee?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. All right, so it looks like we have a couple more minutes with Bob for maybe one more question, if anybody has one. Final comment, and then we'll let Bob go. I'm looking, looks like we, okay. Well, thanks Bob, this is great. Thanks so much for taking the time.
No, my pleasure, and you know, it's I appreciate the chance to be here. And if there's any other comments or communications, I'm sure Crystal can provide my email and Merida's email, and we're happy to respond to you in that capacity as well.
Yeah, I believe it's in the slide deck as well, but sure, people can reach out.
As we do on virtual meetings. Bye, everybody.
Bye, Bob.
Thanks, Bob.
All right, take care.
Bye, Bob. Thank you.
Bye, Lori. Take care. Bye, Bill.
All right. So before we have Bill present, I'm just going to launch a poll, which we will unpack a little bit later. But let me go ahead and launch that. So to what extent is the economic downturn affecting your APS programs? So we'll just have this up for a bit. Hopefully you're seeing the poll on the screen. Looks like you are. The horse race starts. Always looks like a little bit like a horse race when it's coming in. All right. Give it a couple more seconds to cast your vote. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the polling, and I'll share those results. So it looks like moderate effect 38%, neutral 33%, major 24%, minor 5%, and no effect 0%. So very interesting. So, and to get that poll off of your screen, you just have to click the close the box. All right, so we will we'll talk a little bit more about that in the processing, but without further ado, I'm going to hand it on over to Bill Benson. And Bill, just tell me when you want me to move the slide. Are you there, Bill? Looks like you're on mute.
You're right. I was on mute. Can you hear me now okay?
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Krista and Lori, for pulling this all together, and all the folks that you're working with in California for the Leadership Institute for Adult Protective Services. I know that Bob and Meredith have now left, but I just have to do a big shout out to them and their work on behalf of the Elder Justice Coalition. We actually share an office with them, although we're not doing that currently, because Bob actually does go into the office probably almost on a daily basis. But Kendra, who is my incredible colleague here working on behalf of NAPSA in the Washington, D.C. area, both Kendra and I are working from home, as is, I believe, Meredith. So we don't see each other physically as we did before, but we work very closely together, not only as members of the Elder Justice Coalition, but more importantly as probably the most significant voices, NAPSA that is, as well as the Elder Justice Coalition, in pushing for not just the Elder Justice Act, but any other issue related to dealing with elder abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And I'll probably talk a little bit more about that. But just my opening screenshot here, my slides on the left, that is the U.S. Capitol, which in non-pandemic times is just down the road from where we are each day. I'm actually speaking to you from my home in a rural part of Maryland outside of Baltimore. So I cannot see the Capitol from here at all. And the picture on the right-hand side, of course, for those of you who go to Sacramento from time to time, that is an old view of the state capitol in Sacramento. And I'm a Sacramento boy. That's where I went to high school. That's where I went to college. And I took that photograph during protests over the Cambodian invasion during the Vietnam War. So that's one of my photos, but I thought makes me reminisce about my California days. Next slide, please. Next slide, Krista, please. And I'm going to reminisce a little bit more too. That's me on the left-hand side when I was the state long-term care ombudsman at the California Department of Aging. And my sidekick, Kendra, who unfortunately is engaged in another activity at the moment and is not on here, when she saw that picture, she goes, "Is that a rotary phone?" And indeed, it is a rotary phone. And you'll see over my right shoulder is the technology of the day, a map of California. So I knew where all the folks that I worked with were located. And the picture on the right-hand side is a tribute to my mentor in California. I had a couple mentors, but if there's anybody on this webinar who is an old timer, you may remember the name Emma Gunterman. So that's a picture of me with Emma and her husband, Joe Gunterman. Emma was an incredible advocate. In fact, she was a paid lobbyist for California rural legal assistance, specifically on senior citizen issues. She was the senior citizen advocate or lobbyist for CRLA, and she was a powerhouse. And I learned so much from her. She passed away not really that many years ago. And Joe Gunterman, her husband, was also probably the premier child welfare advocate. So they were quite a team, quite a household, and they were legendary in the state capitol. And so I learned a lot from both, but especially Emma Gunterman. Next slide, please.
Sure, Bill. I think there might be a delay for you, but just wanted to tell you. Are you seeing the slide you want?
Yeah, now I am. Yep.
Okay, great.
This is an old slide. It's dated in terms of the dollar amounts, but it was produced by the Congressional Research Service, CRS, which is the research arm of Congress, and it's an extraordinary asset to Congress. As For Bob and I, as former congressional staffers, we rely just extensively on the nonpartisan CRS, just an incredible place. And this is something they put together a number of years ago. And I think the slide just speaks for itself. It shows the amount of federal dollars at that time spent on abuse and neglect. And you can see that the amount of money that went to elder abuse was just a tiny slice, less than 2% of the total funding for abuse and neglect. Now, the slide, the dollar amounts are dated, but I think that there's been no change in the relative sizes of each of the slices of that pie. The amount of money going to elder abuse or adult abuse, apart from domestic abuse, remains at probably right around 2%. That $153.5 million, we can pinpoint that today to roughly $222 million instead of 153. So it's gone up a teeny bit, but relative to the amount of money spent on domestic abuse and child abuse, it remains a very tiny wedge. And I don't think that anybody in the world of adult protective service would argue that child abuse gets too much money or that domestic violence gets too much money. But I think the message is that we don't get enough money to deal with elder abuse. So the size of the pie itself needs to grow. And it's important to recognize that money does talk. We do know from the data and research, we know that reports, now maybe this is not true during the pandemic itself because it's a different set of dynamics, but we know that overall reports of domestic violence and child abuse have actually been dropping because we've been spending money to address them. And we know that reports of elder abuse are going up and we're not spending money on it, or at least nothing that's significant. Next slide, please, Krista. So I'm gonna spend just a couple of minutes doing a little bit of going back over history, if I can, to talk about APS policy and funding. In the 1970s, authorization for protective services for adults was established under Title 20 of the Social Security Act. And that led to states creating their own adult protective service units. And that really got a boost, quite honestly, from the creation of Title 20 of the Social Security Act. In 1981, under President Ronald Reagan, Title 20 was converted to what we today call the Social Services Block Grant. It's still authorized under Title 20 of the Social Security Act, but we call it the Social Services Block Grant, or SSBG, and that was authorized and created in 1991. It provides funds to states and territories to support social services for vulnerable children, adults, and families. And it has 5 broad goals from the outset with SSBG: to prevent or remedy neglect, abuse, or exploitation of children and adults unable to protect their own interests. That was one of the 5 broad goals. And SSBG created or recognized 29 categories of services that a state could fund with their SSBG allocation, including protective services for adults, protective services for children, and 27 other categories of services dealing with everything from case management to meals to a variety of other services. And we'll get back to that in a minute. The picture on the right, I put that in there only because that is the only congressional report, to my knowledge, ever issued devoted to protective services. And that comes from the US Senate in 1977. Now, more recently, because of the work of NAPSA, we were able to get Congress to ask the Government Accountability Office, or GAO, to do a job, as in GAO parlance are called doing jobs, but essentially to do a study and issue a report to Congress on adult protective services, which they did do, and that's been of great help to us. But historically, very little attention to protective services for adults by Congress. Next slide, Krista. Continuing on, when SSBG was originally established, it was authorized at or funded at $2.7 billion. Now it's just over $1.7 billion. So it's been reduced by a whopping $1 billion. And that happened overnight. As part of the 1996 Welfare Reform Initiative that was basically an agreement between President Clinton, Newt Gingrich, and others to reform welfare. That's where we got TANF, for example. You know, food stamps became the SNAP program, and AFDC became the TANF program. All of that came out of the Welfare Reform Act of 1996. And in order to finance welfare reform, the administration and Congress agreed to borrow $1 billion from SSBG to be repaid in 4 years. Unfortunately, not a penny of that was ever repaid. And so since that time, the SSBG's been funded at approximately $1.7 billion. It was as high as, I think, 1.9, and then because of some other cuts that occurred, it's been held at about 1.7 billion. And much of the work over the past couple of decades has been spent not trying to increase SSBG by advocates like NAPSA and others, but to prevent it from being cut even further and even to be eliminated. There have been several proposals, very serious proposals from the White House and from others in the last couple of decades to actually eliminate SSBG. And I could spend a long time talking about the political dynamics of that, but I will save some of that. Next slide, Krista. Before I come back to SSBG, and let me just, before I leave it, and I'll come back to it in a minute, for those of you in California, which is everybody on this, on this webinar, you do not use SSBG dollars to support APS. So SSBG isn't significant to you in the same way as it is to 37 other states that do choose to use SSBG to pay for adult protective services. In fact, there are some states that pay for their entire APS program out of SSBG. And SSBG is the only source of federal money currently going to adult protective services. But again, that's at a state option to do that. And 37 states do that. California does not. Continuing on with this little APS policy brief, the Older Americans Act, and I had a big hand in helping to reauthorize the Older Americans Act on a couple of occasions when I worked in the US Congress, and probably my pride and joy from that time is the creation of what's known as Title VII of the Older Americans Act, the Elder Rights title, and that includes 2 chapters, one devoted to the long-term care ombudsman program and one devoted to elder abuse, neglect, and exploitation. That is not a funding source for adult protective services. It's too little. The total amount of funding under the elder abuse chapter of the Older Americans Act is just over $5 million to prevent elder abuse. And again, I could spend a long time talking about that. I won't do that here, but suffice it to say that when we authorized that in the Older Americans Act, Reauthorization Act in 1992, it was authorized, or the appropriation the following year was about $5 million. It has remained virtually flat funded since fiscal year 1993, 27 years. That is a monumental failure in advocacy by all of us, and certainly by the Aging Services Network. That I just can't put it more bluntly. It's a monumental failure to not see any appreciable increase in funding in the only pot of money designed to prevent elder abuse in this country. Just imagine, I think there's some 600 area agencies on aging in the United States. That $5 million gets divided up among those 600 area agencies on aging. When it hits the community level, it is insignificant. Not that people don't do creative and good things with it, I think many in the Aging Network would do good things with $1, but it really is negligible. And then, of course, there's the Elder Justice Act, which Bob devoted much of his conversation to, which was enacted in 2010, as Bob said, as part of the Affordable Care Act. It was first introduced in 2003, so it took us 7 years in order to actually get it enacted into law. And that's now we're trying to get it reauthorized, and that's much of what Bob talked about, and I'll return to that as well. Next slide, please, Krista. The Elder Justice Act, when it passed in 2010, it had great potential for adult protective services. First, it provided the first ever dedicated federal funding specifically for adult protective services, including an authorization of $100 million in money to go to the state agency responsible for APS in each state, money to flow directly from the feds to your agencies that run APS at the state level. It also provided for $25 million in money for demonstration grants for adult protective services. And then it also was intended to create a home for adult protective services, a place where APS could be thought about, worked on, promoted, and advanced. And we now have that office. That has been a success. Prior to the passage of the Elder Justice Act, there was not one single federal employee who was devoted full-time to adult protective services or even elder abuse. That's changed because we now have, at the Administration for Community Living, we have the Office of Elder Justice and Adult Protective Services. We never had that before, and it's got staff and it's got funding. And I'll talk about that a little bit. But that was the potential. Next slide, Krista. But the reality was we got close, but no cigar. And by that, I mean, we got the law passed, we got it enacted in law, we got it signed by the president, it authorized these funding levels, but we've been incredibly unsuccessful in getting the funding. There's a lot of reasons for that. Probably most notably in the beginning was the fact that because the Elder Justice Act was part of the Affordable Care Act, because that was the vehicle that we had to get it enacted into law, that was immediate political baggage. As most of you know very well, Republicans have tried repeatedly to to repeal the Affordable Care Act. So it made it very tough, particularly for Republican members of Congress, to embrace the Elder Justice Act and provide funding for it when it was tied, it was linked to the Affordable Care Act. We've tried hard to overcome that and not had a great deal of success. So essentially, we have been able to get a little money appropriated since 2014 for elder justice activities, but it's a small amount of money. And I'll say a little bit more about that, but it's been enough. It's been enough to finance that office that I mentioned at the Administration for Community Living. That's been really good. And it's been enough to provide ACL with some money to do some demonstration grants and some research. And that's been very good too. For example, that little bit of money has enabled ACL to create, with the state's full voluntary participation, the national NAMERS, the National Adult Maltreatment Reporting System, which is incredibly important. That came out of the Elder Justice Act, the funding through the Elder Justice Act. But there was never enough money, and there remains not enough money to send a single nickel, a single penny to state APS to support their basic operations. So we got close, but so far no cigar, but we haven't given up. Next slide, Krista. I might just add that 2 points to my previous slide, that the total amount of money that we have been able to get under the Elder Justice Initiative through the Elder Justice Act funding the total amount has been $12 million. And that's, as I said, has gone to demonstration grants and supporting ACL's office. A far cry from the levels that we had hoped for. I might also mention that when the bill was first drafted in 2003, the authorization level for state funding for APS was 300 million. We ended up with 100 million after all was said and done being authorized. But even in 2003, the goal was to try to get a sizable amount more than that. For the current fiscal year we're about to go into, FY21, that Bob talked about, for fiscal year 21, which begins October 1, the House has passed their appropriations bill, and it would increase the elder justice funding from 12 million to 14 million. But of course, still a long way from the overall funding that we hope for. And we don't know what's going to happen with a continuing resolution until the Senate finally completes their work on FY21. So I'm now going to talk about elaborate a little bit on some of the things that Bob talked about. He mentioned the Grassley's bill, Senator Grassley, joined by 2 Republican senators, McSally of Arizona and Senator Daines of Montana, S 4182, that would reauthorize the Elder Justice Act and do some other things. And then in the House of Representatives, Chairman Richard Neal, Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, together with Congresswoman Bonamici from Oregon, have introduced H.R. 8079. They're very different bills, but they both reauthorize the Elder Justice Act, and they both really do, we think, good things for adult protective services. Next slide, Krista. Senator Grassley's bill, S 4182, would reauthorize the Elder Justice Act, including the Adult Protective Services provisions for 4 years for a total of $620 million total over the 4 years. So for that office at ACL, the APS office, it would give them $5 million per year to operate. It would increase the authorization of funding to states for APS to $120 million a year. That's up $20 million over what the Elder Justice Act, when it was first enacted, authorized. And that the reason for that $20 million increase in authorization, according to Senator Grassley's staff, it is strictly based on a cost of an inflationary increase over the course of these past 10 years. And then ACL would get an increase to $30 million authorized for demonstration grants. But the really critical thing for us, besides that, in Senator Grassley's Emergency Support for Nursing Homes and Elder Justice Reform Act, is that it would provide emergency funding specifically for adult protective services. It would appropriate. It wouldn't rely on just authorizations and then going through the normal appropriations process. It would provide directly through that bill $60 million from any COVID-19 legislation passed after July 1 would be made available to states for APS to be spent through fiscal year 2021. It also, just as an aside, of that 60 million, 3% would be set aside to go to tribes for tribally operated adult protective services agencies. And Senator Grassley, because he's been working hard to try to get this bill incorporated into the Senate's version of the 4th COVID recovery bill that Bob talked about, that we've been, pinning our hopes on, to be quite honest, Senator Grassley's been trying to tee up a series of amendments to the vehicle that the Senate has used. You've probably read about it. It was called the HEALS Act, or other people have referred to it as the skinny bill, a skinny version of COVID funding for a 4th package. Senator Grassley has introduced several amendments to add to that particular bill. And so in that, he's added more money for APS, providing for $185 million for a single year period for APS. Of that amount, $150 million would go to states to operate their APS programs, to support their APS programs during the pandemic. and the aftermath of the pandemic. We've really worked hard to get that kind of language in both the Senate and House bills, so that money can get out to you folks, because APS has not gotten any of the pandemic emergency money from any of the previous COVID recovery relief packages that Congress has passed, such as the CARES Act. Bob mentioned that meals programs have gotten $700+ million during the pandemic. The Older Americans Act has gotten other funding, but there's been no funding for APS. So there's been a lot riding on this fourth bill that we're trying to get passed. Next slide, Krista.
Hey, Bill, just a quick question from Jill. Does the bill contain provisions that would prevent states from cutting current funding to APS if the new federal funding is introduced? And so her question refers to both of the new federal bills.
It does, and it does on the House side, and I'm going to come back to that, Jill. That's a great question, and I'm going to talk about that in just a couple of moments. But if I somehow, nope, I'll get to it because it's right there in that slide. So I'm now going to shift over to the House. You will recall, I hope, that in all this debate in Congress about a fourth COVID recovery package, the House of Representatives passed their mega bill, over $3 trillion bill, on May 15th, called the HEROES Act. It didn't include much for adult protective services directly, but it included a whopping increase in SSBG funding. And I'll return to that, but more recently, and Bob talked about this, Richard Neal, chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, introduced with Representative Bonamici of Oregon, the Elder Justice Reauthorization Act of 2020, several weeks ago. And then, as Bob mentioned, just last week, Senator Wyden and Casey introduced their companion measure in the Senate. So we now have in the House and the Senate these two bills, in addition to the Senator Grassley's bill and a companion piece to that in the House. Now, what's significant about this in Grassley is that Senator Grassley is the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. The Senate Finance Committee is the committee with jurisdiction over the Elder Justice Act, but more importantly, over the entire Social Security Act, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security itself, and the SSBG program. Similarly, in the House Ways and Means Committee is the committee of jurisdiction over Medicare, Social Security, the Social Security Act, including SSBG, as well as the Elder Justice Act. The only difference in the House is that Medicaid does not fall under Ways and Means. That's under a different committee, but that's not directly relevant to our discussion today. So in the Neal Bonamici bill, and again, let me add another aside, Senator Wyden is the ranking Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee with Senator Grassley. So these are powerful members. And Senator Casey is the ranking member, the senior Democrat, on the Senate Special Committee on Aging. So these are all very senior members. And Representative Bonamici chairs the House subcommittee that is responsible for the Older Americans Act. So their legislation would also reauthorize the Elder Justice Act itself, including its APS provisions, for a 4-year period, but at a much higher level. It would fund the HH office, the ACL office for APS at $12 million per year. Its funding to states for adult protective services, they would authorize it at $300 million a year, which is $200 million over the authorization level that we've been operating with since 2010. Although ironically, that's the amount we first put in the bill back in 2003. But I must say the Ways and Means staff really do get APS, and they're really committed to it. That's been, even if we end up not successful this year, I'm optimistic about going into next year in terms of finally feeling that we have staff in Congress, both in the House and the Senate, who really do get APS. That's really important in the long run. And then, of course, they would also up the money that ACL gets for funding things like the Leadership Institute, precisely for APS-related demonstration grants and programs to $75 million a year. But really significantly in this legislation, this is the part that we just so want to get passed as quickly as possible, and that is emergency COVID funding for APS. And the vehicle for which they would do that in the House and the Senate with the Wyden-Casey bill is they would, and this is really important, and I want to dwell on this for a minute. SSBG, as I mentioned earlier, it's left to the states to pick and choose which of the 29 services that are allowable under SSBG they're going to fund. You know, a state could fund some, could fund all 29 services or just one of those 29 services. And NAPSA is an active member of what's known as the SSBG Coalition, been around for many, many years. It's a terrific group made up of the National Association of Counties, the American Public Human Services Administrators Association, the National Council on Aging, the National Association of Area Agencies on Aging, disability groups, the Children's Defense Fund, the Child Welfare League of America. It really is intergenerational. But one of the founding principles has been to keep SSBG intact and to not carve out money for a particular program. But what these two bills would do would be to actually appropriate $200 million new dollars for SSBG for the sole purpose of supporting adult protective services. That is a profound statement, not only of support for APS, but for the way of addressing SSBG financing, to actually say, we've got to put money into APS out of SSBG because we know states aren't spending part of their SSBG like California for APS, and other states aren't spending enough, and particularly during this pandemic. So if this were to pass, states must obligate their funds within 120 days of receipt of those funds, and they must spend them by December 31st, 2021. Now, this gets right to Jill's question. There's express language in the bill that says that states must supplement, not supplant, state general revenue funds being spent for adult protective services. So we are excited about that language, but it doesn't go far enough. And so we've been working with both Neil and Bonamici's staff and with Wyden-Casey's staff that if they're able to move their legislation forward, that provision needs to also say funds must supplant, not supplant any other GR funding that's going for APS. So it's our understanding, if this is true, that in California, for example, that you may be getting funding from local general revenue funding. So we want to be sure that it doesn't supplant that. And the other thing that we want to do is make sure that these funds supplement, not supplant, existing state expenditures under SSBG for APS. That doesn't matter in California, but in Tennessee, for example, or Alabama or North Carolina, where they fully fund their APS program out of SSBG, what we don't want to have happen is have some emergency money come in for APS out of SSBG, and then the state government in those states say, well, we can free up some SSBG money that we were already spending for APS for other purposes. So we want to amend that not supplant language to be broader than it currently is. And we've had a very positive reaction from the staff in both the House and the Senate. And then another major precedent-setting development with respect to SSBG is that this provision would also set aside 10 million of that 200 million for APS from SSBG, specifically for tribal adult protective services. Indian tribes have never been able to access directly SSBG funding. It has been solely funding to states, and tribes have had to go and work with state governments if they wanted to try to access some portion of SSBG. This would break that precedent and provide a direct funding stream out of SSBG to tribes solely for the purpose of adult protective services. So needless to say, that has been, this is really important language to us. But it all hinges, this emergency funding all entirely hinges on whether or not Congress does pass that fourth COVID recovery bill. And that's the holy grail for us right now, to get money out to you fast to support states' SSBG. So let me move on now to the next slide and return to the HEROES Act that I mentioned earlier. The HEROES Act, which is the House version of a fourth COVID package that it passed on May 15th. The Senate has passed nothing since then, but the House passed this on May 15th. It would provide an extraordinary increase of $9.6 billion for SSBG. Remember, the current SSBG funding nationwide is $1.7 billion. So this is represents a whopping increase. And the reason for that is that the House believes that SSBG is a very efficient way to get money to state and local governments fast, and has great flexibility for local and state government to spend those dollars. It's been used in the past along these lines for after Katrina, Hurricane Katrina. There was a supplemental amount added to SSBG to give money to states that were suffering from the aftermath of Katrina for emergency purposes. And so this, if this were to pass, if this were to be agreed to, then of course it would represent a huge boost to states with SSBG, which would mean that states' APS programs could hopefully be able to lay claim to some of that additional money. States that, particularly states like California that don't spend any on APS, if this were to pass, it would provide a vehicle for maybe getting SSBG into APS. And the thing that I have to say that's especially important about this in California, that the HEROES Act would require that 50% of that money go directly to local governments. So it would not get, it would not stay at the state. 50% would go to local jurisdictions. So that's a piece, that's important. I might also just spend a moment on the next slide, if I could, Krista. Within the HEROES Act, if you can read that on the right-hand side, it provides $10 million for elder rights protection activities under the Older Americans Act, including the long-term care ombudsman program under Title VII of the Older Americans Act, and adult protective service programs through the Elder Justice Act. That's a very small amount of money to be divided up between the ombudsman and APS, and as well as 5 million of that 10 million for senior legal services. So it's not significant from a dollar standpoint, but what's significant is it's the first time that within Older Americans Act funding, there's explicit language about providing funding for APS. You know, as I mentioned much earlier in this presentation, the Older Americans Act Title VII has that elder abuse, neglect and exploitation prevention chapter, just $5 million roughly, of which none of it's used for APS. We think that this lays the groundwork in the future for potentially trying to get money appropriated through that chapter that can go to APS if we are unsuccessful through other means like the Elder Justice Act. So I just wanted to touch on that for just a moment. So let me dwell for a second. How am I doing time-wise, Krista?
You're doing great, Bill. It's about 10:15, so we had you slated till about 10:30 or so.
Okay, I want to dwell on this for a moment. If more money were to become available to states for SSBG funding, it would require, whether you're a state that spends no money on SSBG or just a little bit, which is true in some, I think Minnesota, for example, 4% of their APS program is funded by SSBG, as contrasted to, say, Alabama, as I mentioned, which fully funds APS out of SSBG. The advocacy would be absolutely essential by your organizations, your agencies, your allies, because there's going to be a lot of constituents wanting some of that money, and it's a choice that's left up to states and local jurisdictions. I will say that one of the reasons that the House, and their House staff told us this explicitly, that one of the reasons they put this language into the old, not on this graph, but the preceding one, the reason they put the big bump up in SSBG funding is because the National Governors Association, which is a bipartisan organization that represents the nation's governors, and is in fact, it's co-chaired by Republican governor, in fact, Governor Hogan of my state of Maryland, and a Democratic governor. In the letter they wrote to Congress about COVID funding needs in states, of course, their major issue is we need emergency funding to support state and local government. But they explicitly said more money needs to go to SSBG. That's a first. That's a first. And moreover, the American Public Human Services Association, which represents states and local human services agencies, they also called for much greater increase in funding for SSBG. So a lot of voices were chiming in that have been fairly silent over the last few years for more money for SSBG. But if it should come to pass that more money flows, we're going to need all the advocates out there like you folks to say to your state and local governments, some of this has to go to APS. And we also, as Bob said, we need your advocacy also to support the HEROES Act, as well as Senator Grassley's and Senator Wyden's and Casey's and Representative Neal's and Bonamici's legislation for the Elder Justice Act. And knowing that you have limits, what you can do, there are a variety of trade associations that do have clout, whether it's the National Governors Association, the National Conference of State Legislatures, the Council of State Governments, the Republican Governors Association, the Democratic Governors Association, lots of NACO, the National Association of Counties, CWDA. You all have lobbyists and advocates, and they have a lot of priorities, and hopefully funding, getting legislation passed for SSBG and for the Elder Justice Act and for APS can make it into those organizations' priority list, because it represents direct funding to state and local governments for the services that you provide. Next slide, Krista. I'm going to just say a little bit more about SSBG, and leave it at that, but this was produced a couple of years ago when the SSBG coalition that I talked about, which includes the Child Welfare League, Children's Defense Fund, the Child Welfare League of America, aging organizations, NAPSA, and others, they thought that putting APS forward would really help to raise the profile of the social services block grant. And it's finally beginning to pay off with things like the provisions that I just talked about, emergency funding during the COVID pandemic for SSBG. And I must say, this document you'll see in the lower left-hand corner was actually published, and the graphics and all of that were provided by the National Association of Counties. NACO has done a great job with the SSBG issue, and they've been very supportive of highlighting adult protective services. So we just really value our partnership at the national level with NACO. Very, very important voice, and I know they are for all of the counties in California. Next slide. So, you know, just to further inform all of you about SSBG, because it's not relevant to you in the same way it is other states, because as you can see in the yellow strip there, California spends not a dime of its SSBG funding on adult protective services. We'd love to see that change. I'm sure you would like to see that change. It'll be hard to change without additional money because, you know, largely that money's spoken for. And as you can see in California, you largely spend that money on services for people with disabilities in the category of special services for the disabled, as well as foster care services for adults and daycare services for both adults and children. You know, I don't know enough about what that actually translates to in California under the category of daycare for adults or foster care for adults, but it clearly, I see a note from somebody saying she can't hear me. Can you hear me, Krista?
Yes, I can, Bill. So I think that might be on Felisa's line. So
Okay.
I'll write back to her. Thank you.
Okay. So, you know, that just paints the picture. I might just as an aside, it is interesting. One of the things that the Social Services Block Grant allows, it allows states to transfer money from TANF into SSBG. It's got to be child welfare related. So it would be very difficult to transfer TANF dollars for adult protective services, although we've seen some data that says that has happened in a couple of states. But California does transfer a sizable amount of TANF funding, as you can see here, from TANF to daycare for children and from TANF to foster care for children. That's noteworthy. Some states transfer no funds from TANF into SSBG, but California does to the tune of almost $400 million. That may be disconcerting to TANF advocates, but it's something that California does. So next slide, Krista.
Sure.
So the data that we were just looking at for California was for the year 2017. That's the most recent federal data that we have about SSBG expenditures in the states. Every state is required through SSBG to provide annual reports to HHS. SSBG is administered by a very small staff at the Administration for Children and Families inside HHS. ACF, Administration for Children and Families, is a companion agency to the Administration for Community Living, which of course is where the Older Americans Act is managed. It's also where the Elder Justice Act is managed to the extent that there's anything to manage at this time. ACF, though, is the host entity for SSBG. So states have to give them various reports about how they spend their money under SSBG. And the most recent year in which ACF has issued a report is 2017. So when we say 37 states are spending SSBG funding on adult protective services to the tune of combined $217 million, that's from 2017 data. I put the report on the left-hand side, California's Title 20 Block Grant Post Expenditure Report for fiscal year 2001, because that's the most recent one we can find on ACF's website. So, you know, hopefully California has actually published or sent a more recent report than 2001, and I'm sure they have. It's just not available to us. So on the right, you see the contact people, for whom anybody, who wants to say, how do we spend our money in California for SSBG? Why aren't you spending it for adult protective services, or whatever you want to say? Those are the people that ACF believes are responsible for SSBG in the state of California.
Hey, Bill, so Lee has a question, and sorry if you already covered this, but are you able to speak about the history of California's decision not to use the funding for APS, or is that outside of your scope?
Yeah, I cannot speak to that history, but I don't believe they have ever done so. I am not aware of them ever having done so. No, I can't speak to that. And, sadly, I was in California for the early years of the Social Services Block Grant at the California Department of Aging. And I'll be candid, I'd never heard of SSBG when I was there. I had never heard of SSBG until I came to Washington, D.C. And the truth is, very few people in those days, or up until recently, anywhere in the country had heard of SSBG vis-a-vis aging. I think that's changed a great deal. So no, I don't know why California never made the cut. I suspect, no, I don't know. I won't even speculate because I do not know. I can always speculate, but I do not know.
Thanks.
Okay. Next slide.
Sure.
So I know my time is getting short, and I'm going to gloss over these fairly quickly because we're going to do another session, in November, right, Krista?
Yes, that's correct.
And we're going to do a deeper dive into these topics. This is the issue of other funding sources for adult protective services. And of course, apart from SSBG, the other major funding source in states for APS is from state general revenue. And as I understand it from Lori and Krista, counties spend their general revenue funding, local tax funding for APS at the community level as well. But in most states, if it's not SSBG, it's state general revenue is the primary source. And of course, thinking back to that poll that Krista did a little while ago before I started speaking, we of course are terribly worried nationally about shortfalls in federal and in state and local revenue, and how that might translate into support for adult protective services and other critical services for folks. So that's a really, really huge issue for us. And so, decisions to reduce general revenue funding for APS, obviously would have grave implications potentially for adult protective services. Next, I want to talk for just a moment about VOCA, the Victims of Crime Act funding. And we'll get into a little bit of a deeper dive on that. I might mention that Lori Delegrammaticus wrote a terrific issue brief for the National APS Resource Center, the TARC, on VOCA funding. It really is a tremendous primer. If you've not seen it, I hope that we will get it to you post-haste. It really does a great job of describing the potential of VOCA for funding adult protective services within states. Now, VOCA money cannot be used for investigative purposes, but it's intended for victims of crime, and certainly APS serves victims of crime. So it would allow, it provides the ability for APS programs at the state and local level to apply to the state VOCA office for VOCA funding. And in some states, there's been some really recent good success in doing just that. One of the standout states is Philadelphia. I'm sorry, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has really done a fabulous job providing VOCA funding for adult protective services to create special units, special intake workers, ways of helping APS clients who are victims of crime. to access everything from legal services, access healthcare services, access victim services. So VOCA has sort of emerged as a new potential, limited but new funding source for APS in states, but it's completely up to states to make those decisions. And we had a big breakthrough, we think recently, just a couple of weeks ago, when the National VOCA Administrators Association had their annual VOCA conference. They actually had a session on using VOCA funding to fund elder abuse related activities, and invited Lori to be one of the speakers, Lori on behalf of NAPSA, about APS. That was breakthrough for us. VOCA conferences are closed events. We can't go, but Lori was able to do that. The downside at the moment is that the promise of VOCA came from two directions. One was federal action to clarify that elders are equally entitled to Victim of Crime Act services along with other victims of crime. That was something that, while the law always provided for it, it wasn't clear, and it's clear now. But the other was through the mechanism for funding VOCA at the national level. VOCA is funded not by appropriations by the appropriations committees. There is the Victims of Crime Act fund. There's a trust fund that is where monies from prosecutions and major fines and other things like that go into this Victim of Crimes Act trust fund. And it's a very large amount of money. Congress determines how much of that fund can be set aside each year to go out to states to fund their VOCA programs. And in recent years, because of the growth of the trust fund, the fund itself has grown because the amounts of penalties and fines coming into it, Congress upped the amount of money that can be spent dramatically. Let me give you an example. In fiscal year 2014, that pot of money nationwide was $745 million. In FY15, it jumped more than threefold to $2.36 billion. And in FY18, it jumped again to $4.4 billion. That was such a huge increase that it allowed states to begin funding things they hadn't been funding before, like elder abuse and adult protective services. Unfortunately, because the amount of money coming into the fund itself through fines and penalties and assessments has actually been decreasing in recent years. The overall pot has decreased, and therefore the amount that Congress has been allowing to go out to states has also dropped. So that's a drag on the ability to fund new things that VOCA has not funded in the past. That's just a reality check. So to put it in perspective, the VOCA funding nationwide jumped to $4.4 billion. It dropped to $3.5 billion in FY19. And in this year, it's dropped not quite 50%, but it's now $2.64 billion. And the president in his FY21 budget reduced it further to $2.3 billion. The House, in their appropriations bill for FY21, beginning October 1, they increase it just slightly to $2.65 billion. And of course, the Senate has not yet acted. So I elaborate on that only to suggest that while VOCA has immense promise, the reality that states have less VOCA money obviously reduces the likelihood of funding things they've never funded before. Yet, having said that, elder victims of crime are equally entitled to those services and should be getting some of them. So if they're not in states, the state VOCA program should be paying attention no matter what to the older adult population. I will spend a good deal of time in November talking about funding under Medicaid, which we sometimes refer to as Title 19 of the Social Security Act. And of course, for you Californians, you know it lovingly as Medi-Cal. There is the possibility of obtaining funding under Medicaid. It's not easy to do. In fact, it's quite difficult, to be honest, but there is the opportunity to provide funding under what are known as the administrative claiming procedures of Medicaid that allows for funding Medicaid-related clients through the Medicaid program that can be used to support adult protective services. It's complicated to get that Medi-Cal funding or Medicaid funding. One of the avenues for that is something that's known as SPMP, which is skilled professional medical personnel. So, for example, the SPMP provision could allow for the funding of paying for nurses, for example, in an APS program that are working with Medicaid clients or Medi-Cal clients. But accessing that Medi-Cal funding, that Medicaid funding, whether it's for SPMP purposes or other purposes, is serious business, and it requires some sophistication. You know, basically, the APS program needs to be included in the state's federal cost allocation plan in order to be able to get approval to spend Medi-Cal or Medicaid funding for APS. So you've got to be part of the state's federal cost allocation plan, and the APS program has to have the infrastructure and processes in place to collect the information necessary that's required to get reimbursed by the federal government for Medicaid. So it's arcane and it's complex, and probably even more complex in California, because you're probably not doing this at the state level. You're probably doing it on at the county government level. And so we'll get into that in greater detail in November. And then I also just want to acknowledge and shout out for San Francisco, and Jill Nielsen can tell us more about this, but there are some states, and most noteworthy is Ohio, that have used mechanisms to obtain voter approval at the local level for tapping into millage, which is a portion of property tax payments that are set aside for aging services. And Ohio has really done an extraordinary job with this in terms of getting ballots on at election time, getting local ballot initiatives put on the ballot and voted on by the population of a county to take some portion of millage tax and use it to support aging services in Ohio, including specifically adult protective services. So that has been, in fact, in some Ohio counties, the amount of money that they generate from their local mill taxes that have been approved by voters dwarf the amount of money that they get from the Older Americans Act or from Medicaid for aging services. So it's really been important in Ohio. I was out there one year working, doing some work with folks that were passing their levy ballot initiative. It's a levy, basically, is what they call it in Ohio. And there were three different, in the county that covers Cincinnati. I think it's not Franklin, it's, I can't remember the name of the county, but the county that covers Cincinnati, that particular year on the ballot for the November election, there were three ballot initiatives for mill taxes, for levies. One for aging services, one for the Cincinnati Zoo, and one for local law enforcement. The only one that passed was aging services. The zoo and the police department were defeated. Aging services passed. In Ohio, they've had great success in passing these local ballot initiatives for aging services. And again, it's and not every state even has the the legislative basis for doing this, but some states do. But San Francisco has done its version of it with their Dignity Fund. In fact, I've done a lot of work with the city of Baltimore, and the AAA in Baltimore is so enamored with San Francisco's Dignity Fund that they're trying to do something similar in Baltimore. And I imagine Jill has shared information, and maybe we can spend more time on this in November as to how San Francisco was able to get that Dignity Fund and what it means for APS. Next slide, and I think I'm getting to the very end, I hope, Krista, and I know I'm running out of time.
Yeah. So I do want to leave some time for questions and processing, and so there we go.
Okay, I can leave this as is because grant funds, are another source, and obviously one of them is funding this very set of webinars, and the California Leadership funds from ACL, not a sustainable funding source, but one for creative new initiatives and demonstrations and gap filling. I do think, though, that APS programs could begin to think about diversifying and going after different federal grants that they've never gone after before. And again, I hope we can talk about that later. And I'll leave it at that. Krista, my final slide, I think. Yeah. So I'm available to answer any questions that you may have. If I can't answer them now, I'm going to then direct the question to Kendra, because she can answer them all when she's back available, or we'll respond in writing if we can't answer them. So that's my piece for the moment until next time.
Great, thank you, Bill, so much. So I'm going to turn it on over for a little bit. So if Lori and Bill can leave Rabaz and I about 5 minutes for eval and feedback, that would be great. I do want to speak really quickly about the reference to November 18th and December 2nd. That's the fiscal understanding of funding streams. That is for both administrators and APS managers. The reason why we're recording this today is so that everybody who is registered for that can watch this as a primer for our next discussion. And we have confirmed our presenters for that. So we'll have Bill. On November 18th, we'll have Bill, Lee Bills, Chief of Victim Services and Public Safety Branch, to talk about our state VOCA. And then we have Eileen Kubanski, Director of Budget and Fiscal Policy from CWDA, to talk about more about realignment. And then December 2nd, the booster, we have Jennifer Mays from the Philadelphia Corporation for Aging's Elder Victim Support Program, VSP, which Bill referenced. It's a VOCA supported program specifically for APS. So anyway, I just wanted to touch on that really quickly, and we'll be providing that VOCA brief for that that whole bundle of workshops and boosters. So, all right, Lori, Bill, take it away. You're on mute, Lori.
Okay, as you can see on this slide, we're asking you to speak up about how you support your APS program in drawing down funds. Does anybody want to start things out? You can unmute yourself.
Lori, this is Bill. While you're
Sure.
waiting for somebody to chime in, one comment, one question. Are you able to capture and keep the comments that people are making? Because there's some really very important comments being made about the Medicaid claiming dollars, issues around that, who's using it, who's not using it. It'd be really great to capture that. I don't know if you have the wherewithal to do that.
Yeah, so Bill, we download the chat so that we can use it for attendance and also for feedback as well. So we can definitely save that for you for November.
That's fabulous. And I did notice one of the counties commented on that they just don't have the personnel to do the administrative side of it because it is complex. There's no question about it.
Right.
And so I saw that one comment in there and I thought, yeah, that's a really important point.
Right. Kelly, did you want to unmute yourself and expand on that at all, if you're able to?
Yeah, hi. we've looked at this. It's been several years ago we looked at this, and it just wasn't feasible for us to even put the program together to try and draw down these dollars. So it's just kind of been sitting back on the shelf again. So that's
And
about
Kelly,
it.
you're in Shasta County, right?
No, I'm in Nevada County.
Oh, shoot.
That's okay.
Darn.
This is Bill again. I think, yeah, I would assume that that's probably smaller counties, especially, that would be really a challenge. I think of Texas, which is a statewide system. It's not a county-based system. It's a statewide system. And Texas has had good support, has had good experience with Medicaid claiming funding, but they're a big system, and they've been doing it on a statewide basis. So they've had the administrative personnel to do what it takes, but even they acknowledge the complexity of it. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And Bill, this is Lori. I think we should clarify that California does draw down some Medicaid funding for the program itself through Medicaid claiming. That's why you guys all do your time studies, right? So the funding they draw down is 50% of the time for an APS worker by the percentage of clients who are Medicaid eligible, I believe is how that works. But that all comes through the state, and the state runs it up through Health and Human Services Department. And it took me a while when I was the state administrator to kind of figure out what all was happening there. But the SPMP is the part that California has not really been able to negotiate, besides for nurses where they're clearly medical professionals. We keep trying to make the argument that APS social workers do tasks that should qualify as preventing medical problems and should fit in that, and we haven't managed to move that forward. So that's what we need to talk about more on our next time around. But do people, what are your strategies? Let's go back to the transfer topic. How are you working with your board of supervisors, with the state, et cetera, to draw down funds? Has anybody had really good luck working locally to draw down more funding for APS? Ooh, we've got a comment over here. One way of keeping administrative and personnel costs down is to have fiscal process all the SPMP for APS, IHSS, and CPS. Can you expound on that a little bit? Can you unmute yourself?
Elise, are you able to unmute? Let me double check. Looks like you're on the phone, Elise. That might be harder to do. Oh, there you are.
Hi, Lori.
There you are.
What we do is we have a fiscal team that supports the 3 different programs.
Okay.
And it's easier because you have one group who does the claiming for all of us. So they ensure that the time studies are being done correct. If there's any questions or issues, we'll have like a conference call between the 3 different programs. And it's just easier for one, for the claiming, and 2, to ensure that we're meeting the requirements so that we don't end up with a bill at the end.
Got it. That does make sense. Kelly, is that something you guys could try?
I'll certainly bring it up. We're pretty slim right now with personnel, so I don't know how well received that would be, but I certainly will bring it up again.
Yeah, it sounds like at least you get a what do they call that?
Economies of scale.
There you go. Economy of scale. That was the term I was looking for. Yeah.
So Lori, Jeremy from Kern has a question. Jeremy, do you want to unmute yourself?
And not so much a question, but a
Oh,
comment
comment, sorry.
with regards to your stated question about, how do you get funding? We haven't seen an increase in funding really within our county, but in terms of trying to make sure we don't lose funding, it's definitely responding to the requests of our board members, our elected officials when they send in requests. So we respond on all cases very appropriately, but still making a highlighted effort with regards to those that are coming through from those other sources, such as our elected officials, and also trying to highlight to them, hey, we're able to do this because of we got this funding through our Home Safe, or we got this through what we have available currently. So keep us in mind if things change.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. Has Home Safe been helpful as far as maybe not drawing down extra funds for APS, but sort of moving the expenses to that other program? Jeremy, has that helped?
Yeah, I would say for us, it's been a big help in things that would have taken a whole lot longer to get somebody moved into a different level of care. We've been able to streamline that process quite a bit and not just be waiting for some other agency to step in with the funding. We could pull it in and then augment with the other services to make sure that everything is covered.
That makes sense to me. Are other people finding that Home Safe has saved them some funding, some straight APS funding in terms of, again, kind of an economy of scale, moving the expense to another category? You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Why folks do that, I will say that Home Safe came up on the statewide case management survey a lot as helping with being utilized for some case management as well.
Okay, I'm not seeing anyone unmuting themselves. So let's move down to the, how would you draw down funds for COVID recovery? Do you have any ideas around that, around extensive case management services and those kinds of things? Are you seeing opportunities there at all? And again, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Lori, it's Lee from Marin County. Absolutely, as far as extended services or case management, maybe keeping the cases open a little while longer, or maybe going back and checking on the individual 3 or 6 months after we close the case, and then being able to help economically. So many people have been so adversely affected, older adults. So if we were able to have more tangible funds for tangible goods, that would be very helpful.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah. Yeah. And from your lips to Bill's ears, because Bill will be making those requests and making those arguments. Who was going to speak next? I heard you start.
Hi, Lori. This is Felisa from Merced County.
Hi, Felisa.
I just want to echo what Lee had said earlier. I think if we were given the ability to draw down funds for COVID, one thing that I've noticed is there has been a lot of case management that's been needed for our seniors that have been not only affected by COVID, but how our community has been affected by COVID. So it would definitely be looking at the case management component and being able to provide more, maybe dedicate a specific social worker for that, as well as doing the tangible items.
Got it. Okay. Krista, you said you guys needed 5 minutes. Do you want me to wrap this up?
Yeah, how about, can you wrap up, and then we'll, because I want to let folks go on time, because I know everybody's got so many other things going on.
Sure.
So.
Well, thank you all for being on, and some of these questions will get discussed in more in-depth November 18th. So, think about them some more, because we will be looking at what can we do as a strategy on a statewide basis when we talk on the 18th. So with that, Krista, you want to go ahead and do the wrap up?
Yeah, thank you. And we're going to go ahead and stop recording at this point so that we can do a little bit of feedback and you all can take the post test. So